22 minutes. That was the exact time it took me to decide that my military career was worth less than the screams of agony coming through my headset. 14,000 flight hours taught me to follow orders, but flying 10 feet off the ground in the pitch black of the gray zone, guided only by the heat of the blood down below, taught me how to save souls. The truth that newspapers call strategy is, in reality, a mortuary calculation. I was there when the general closed the folder and decreed acceptable casualties. What the public will never know is that, for high command, a soldier's life is worth less than the cost of the fuel in my fuselage. My insubordination was not a technical error. It was the only act of sanity in a war where heroes are discarded like scrap metal as soon as the radio is turned off. Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you now, because this truth almost cost me my life and turned me into a ghost for the system. What I saw when my heart stopped in that cockpit is not in any military manual. If you want to understand what really happens in the shadows, where honor is worth more than the uniform, subscribe here and leave your mark in the comments. Shadow Zero is in the air, and what I have to say they tried to bury with me. Come closer, my son. Get closer to the fire. The cold outside seems to have taken over your joints, hasn't it? Time is a silent master. It unscrews our certainties one by one until only what is eternal remains. Today, I feel that my tent, this old and tired body that has carried me for so many decades, is starting to lose its breath. The Apostle Paul was right, you know. We are just camping here, and the ropes of my tent are getting loose. It is funny how, when the end approaches, the past doesn't come as a memory, but as a scent or a sound. Sometimes, the hum of this heater here in the room turns into the roar of a turbine, and the smell of the tea takes me back to the metallic scent of ozone and hydraulic oil. You know, I wasn't always this man who needs help getting up from the armchair. There was a time when I was Shadow Zero, a pilot, someone who lived among the clouds and the orders of men. But there was a day, that day, that was when my soul began to say goodbye to this world, long before my body did. We were in the gray zone, on the northern border. The air in that operations room was frigid, but it wasn't the cold of nature. It was the cold of a morgue. Do you understand? The general was there, standing with that posture of someone who thinks he owns life and death. He used a laser pointer to circle a point on the digital map, Point Echo. Every time that red light beam passed over the map, I saw faces, not coordinates. I saw young men who had mothers waiting at home. But for the general, they were just threat vectors. The sound of the central air conditioning was an annoying hum, constant, as if it wanted to drown out our conscience. The general closed the folder. The snap of plastic against the table echoed like a gunshot. He looked me in the eyes, those glass eyes with no shine at all, and said the phrase that sealed everything. Acceptable casualties, Shadow Zero. Let their signal fade. There is no rescue. Acceptable casualties. Can you imagine the weight of that? My hands behind my back were so tight that my knuckles turned white. The floor of that room was so waxed that it reflected the fluorescent lights from the ceiling, blinding me. I felt a pang in my chest, a pressure, an agony that wasn't physical. It was the weight of knowing that, for the command, those soldiers were worth less than the fuel for my aircraft. I left there walking across the wet asphalt of the courtyard. The dawn wind cut my face like a razor. Shadow Zero was waiting for me in the hangar, a steel ghost bathed in shadows. The smell of JP-8 fuel was strong in the air. As I walked, I felt every step in my boots, a rhythmic sound, click, clack, click, clack. I entered the cockpit. The space was tight, familiar, but at that moment it felt like a trap. My fingers touched the controls, and I felt a shiver. I knew that if I pulled up that stick, I would be flying out of the world I knew. I was going to stop being a soldier to be just a man before God. The pain in my chest increased, a burning sensation. I put on the headset and the voices started coming in. They weren't codes, they were screams. They were whispers of agony. "Mother," one of them said, and that voice had the timbre of my younger brother. Cold sweat ran down under my helmet. The world around me began to blur. The panel lights, green and orange, began to dance before my eyes. The sound of the radio grew distant, as if I were diving into deep waters. My breathing became short, heavy. Every gulp of air was a struggle. My hand floated over the panel. I found the communication radio toggle for the base. I looked at the dark horizon, where the fire of war stained the sky a sickly purple. My vision began to darken at the edges, a tunnel closing in. My heart gave a jolt, a violent stumble against my ribs, and then a terrifying silence. I turned the key. Click. The metallic sound was the last thing I heard on this side. The world, the orders, the general, gravity, everything vanished. I felt my soul detach from that metal seat as if the tent had finally given way. I was no longer in command. I was slipping out of time, taking the first step into the void, towards the unknown. And then, the darkness embraced me completely. You know, my son, the darkness was not the end. It was just the hallway. At first, what I felt wasn't sight, it was absence. You know when you take off a tight shoe after a whole day of walking? Now multiply that by 1,000. The agony in my chest, that fire that seemed to want to tear me in half in the cockpit of Shadow Zero, it simply went out. It was as if an invisible hand had blown out a candle of pain. I was immersed in a silence that wasn't empty but full. There was no longer the roar of the turbines, nor the annoying static of the radio, nor the smell of hydraulic oil. Everything that was heavy, everything that was made of metal, blood, and fear, was left behind. I felt light. So light that the very idea of gravity seemed like an old joke, something I had forgotten like a bad dream. And it was in that moment of lightness that I realized I was no longer holding the stick. My fingers no longer felt the cold of the metal. I looked down, if you can even say down in that place, and I saw something strange. I saw the cockpit of Shadow Zero getting small, like a child's toy forgotten in the middle of nowhere. I saw a man in there, hunched over the controls, with his helmet fallen over his chest. I didn't feel sorry for him, you know? I felt only an immense gratitude for him having carried me that far. But I knew that that tent, that pilot's carcass, was no longer who I was. Then, the horizon of my being began to change. The darkness, which before was like a protective velvet, began to be tinted by a glow. But it wasn't a glow like this one from the fire in front of us, my son. It wasn't a light that came from a single point, like a lamp or the sun. It was as if the atmosphere itself were becoming light. A radiance that didn't hurt the eyes, but that seemed to wash the soul from the inside. It was a clarity that had the color of dawn, but with an intensity that no painter could ever mix on a palette. And with the light came the sound. Ah, the sound. How could I explain this to you? If I said it was music, I would be lying, because the music of the earth is made of notes that end. Not that. It was like the sound of many waters, an infinite waterfall of harmony that vibrated in every particle of what I was. Was it a choir, perhaps? Millions of voices in a single note of peace? I don't know. I only know that that melody told me I was coming home. I, who spent my life running, flying between clouds of war, was finally landing on soil that had never been stepped on by sin. The warmth began to envelop me. But it wasn't a heat that made you sweat. It was a warmth that welcomed you, like the hug of a father you haven't seen in decades. I felt loved, my son, loved in a way that makes all the medals and honors of this world seem like trash. Every mistake I made, every order the general gave me, every shadow I carried in my soul, all of it was dissolved in that ocean of clarity. I was no longer the traitor, nor the hero, nor Shadow Zero. I was just a sun returning. The light became so strong that the entire universe seemed to disappear, leaving only that golden and white glow. The sound of the waters grew louder, sweeter, as if it were calling me by name. I was no longer afraid. For the first time in eternity, I was safe. I was at peace. But then, something happened. In the center of that radiance, where the light was so pure it seemed solid, I noticed a movement. The harmony of the voices gave a small space for a silence of expectation, a sacred silence. I wasn't floating aimlessly. I was being expected. My eyes, the eyes of my soul, began to focus on something, or rather, on someone who was there, standing right at the edge of my vision. A presence that emanated a gravity of love that attracted me more than any turbine. My breath vanished, not from pain, but from an awe that made me want to fall to my knees, even without having legs. There, in the middle of the torn veil, I realized that the most important encounter of my existence was about to happen, and I was not alone. Ah, my son, what my eyes saw in that instant, the words of this world are like leaky mugs trying to hold the ocean. There is no way to describe the fullness without diminishing it. You know, I spent decades hearing the noise of engines, the crackle of radios, and the dry sound of military orders. But there, in the center of that radiance I told you about, the sound was love itself. A love that had weight, that had substance, a love that washed me. I was no longer alone in the corridor of light. As I moved forward, without moving a muscle, just being drawn by the gravity of grace, I realized that the light was not a thing. It was someone. He was there. I couldn't fix my eyes on his face, such was the glory, but I knew with every atom of my being who he was. It wasn't the general with his folders of acceptable casualties. It was the commander of souls, the pilot of the impossible. And when I got close enough, time simply ceased to exist. There was no more yesterday, no more tomorrow, no more point echo, no more war. There was only the eternal now. There was no movement of lips, understand. We don't need air to speak there. It was an immediate knowing. The moment I looked at that presence, I felt as if he were leafing through the book of my life, but not with the accusing finger of a judge, but with the hands of a father who cleans the wound of a son who fell. Every sin of mine, every time I was selfish, every time I shouted at a subordinate, every shadow I tried to hide under the uniform, it all came to the surface. But my son, listen closely. When those things touched his light, they didn't condemn me, they simply disappeared. They were like drops of black ink falling into a sun of infinite whiteness. He showed me that my act of insubordination on earth had not been a rule-breaking, but a fulfillment of his higher law. No life is acceptable to lose, my son, was what I felt resonate in my chest. I saw, through his knowing, the young men I went to get. I saw the silver threads that connected each of them to the heart of God. I saw that, while the general saw numbers, heaven saw treasures, and he smiled at me, not with teeth and lips, but with an irradiation of peace that made me want to stay there forever. I wanted to dissolve in that light. I wanted to forget that one day I wore heavy boots and that the ground was made of dust and blood. This is your place, I thought, in a sob of the soul. I have finally come home. The communication was deep, visceral. He showed me that true honor doesn't follow the decrees of men sitting in air-conditioned rooms, but follows the whisper of the spirit that says, "Save your brother." I felt that all my sorrows, the weight of being Shadow Zero, the fear of dying alone in that cockpit, it had all been just training for that encounter. I was ready to take the next step, to dive once and for all into the heart of that presence and never look back. I already felt the edges of my individuality melting in that ocean of mercy. It was an ecstasy that hurts because it's so good, if you understand me. But then the light began to change tone. The infinite harmony gained a note of responsibility. The presence didn't move away, but I felt a tug, as if an invisible rope, still tied to that old and tired tent I left in the cockpit, began to stretch. "Not yet," his knowing said, with a sweetness that broke my heart into 1,000 pieces. "Your mission on Earth still has one flight to complete. They need to see that life has won." "No," I tried to scream with my soul. "I don't want to go back. The world is dark, the world is cold. Let me stay here where everything is truth." But his command was absolute, coded in a purpose I still didn't understand. He showed me, for a brief second, the face of that recruit I was yet to meet, the handshake I was yet to receive. And with a breath of life that felt like a hurricane of longing, the light began to recede. The warmth was replaced by weight. The sacred silence was invaded by the high-pitched beep of a monitor, and the smell of ozone returned to burn in my nostrils. I was falling, my son, falling back to my body, back to the pain, back to gravity, bringing with me the sweetest and bitterest secret a man can carry, that heaven is real, but the earth still claims our sweat. The darkness of the cockpit closed the tunnel again, and I breathed, a gulp of air that seemed to swallow burning coals. I was alive, and the nightmare was just beginning. The weight, my son, the weight came back like a wet lead blanket, crushing me against that metal seat I had just forgotten. It was an endless fall, a reverse dive, leaving the ocean of light to be squeezed back into the narrow bottle of this body. My lungs, which before needed nothing, suddenly sucked in the acrid air of the cockpit as if they were swallowing embers. I coughed, a dry, human, ugly sound, and the taste of blood and hydraulic oil flooded my mouth. I was back in the torn tent. I opened my eyes, and the world was green, the ghostly green of the night vision goggles. The fuel alert beep was screaming, a high-pitched sound that seemed to pierce my soul, still sensitive to the harmony of heaven. My hands, they trembled so much I could hardly feel the stick. I looked to the side and saw the radio turned off. The silence I had chosen for myself now felt like a sentence. But behind me, in the cargo hold, I heard a moan, a low cry, a "thank you, my God." And it was there, in that moment of excruciating physical pain, that I understood. The light didn't send me back to suffer, it sent me back to serve. I flew that rest of the way as if angels were holding my rotor blades. The fuel ran out at the exact moment the wheels touched the concrete of the base. The engine died with a sigh of tired metal, just like me. And the reception, the reception was cold as the general's heart. As soon as the doors opened and the wounded began to be removed, I saw the rifle barrels. The military police were there, surrounding the aircraft. The general was standing in the center of it all, arms crossed, his face red with fury. He didn't see the 20 lives I brought back from the abyss. He saw only a switch in the off position. He saw an insubordination that needed punishment. I got out of the cockpit with difficulty. My legs felt like jelly. When the handcuffs closed on my wrists, the sound of metal hitting metal didn't scare me. I looked at the general and, for the first time in my life, I didn't feel fear or anger. I felt a deep pity. He was so tied to that uniform, to those medals, to that idea of power. And me? I had just walked with the owner of the universe. What were those handcuffs compared to the freedom I had seen up there? While they took me to detention, one of those boys, a recruit covered in mud, with a makeshift bandage on his neck, he broke away from the medics for a second. He grabbed my arm. He didn't say a word. He just squeezed my hand, and his eyes shone with a light the general would never understand. In that calloused handshake, I received my true medal. You know, my son, time passed. The prison cell was temporary, but the peace I brought from there, that never left me. Since that day, I have never looked at death with fear again. To the world, death is a wall, a final darkness. To me, it is just a door left ajar to a very brightly lit room. I live here today, tending this fire, feeling the cold in my joints, but my heart, my heart already has its bags packed. Look at me now. I am an old man, a shadow zero who no longer flies. But I brought a message for you before my breath goes out for good. Come closer, listen well. In this life, they will try to convince you that people are numbers. They will give you orders that crush your soul in the name of a logic that knows no mercy. Do not accept that. Never trade your peace for a medal of honor given by men who do not know what love is. Love, my son, love is the only thing you will be able to carry through that light. The rest stays here, rusting in the hangar. Forgive fast. Do not keep the poison of resentment in your chest, because up there, in his presence, resentment has nowhere to hide. Love people as if each one of them were God's most precious treasure, because they are. Do not be afraid to disobey the world to obey your Creator. Sometimes, the greatest act of courage is simply turning off the radio of men to hear his voice. Now, look at the stars out there and rest. The commander is in control of the flight. He knows every turbulence you are going through, and he guarantees you the landing will be safe, and the reception will be with a party that never ends. Go in peace, my son. I will stay here a little longer, just watching the fire, waiting for the moment when the light calls me by name one last time. And this time, I won't need to come back.